In the year 1842, when the wind still dragged its knuckles across the chalk fields of Dogwood Parish and the sun seemed to hang just a little too long above the ridge, there stood a house no cartographer dared draw narrow. Pitch-roof thing of slatted pine and black pitch, shingles that leaned ever so slightly to the left, as if bowing to something buried deep beneath it. They called it the Carroway House, though no one could say why, only that the name felt old and unwelcome in the mouth, like biting into bone. No roads ran to it, no paths dared veer near. Even deer skirted the hill's edge like it belonged to something older than the trees. And yet, 3 women lived within those creaking walls, sisters, it was said, though no birth records existed, no baptismal accounts, and certainly no family to name their origin. Eunice, and Merp Carroway, spoken always in that order, as if it were a spell. They wore mourning black year-round, their cloaks trailing like wool through the wheat stubble, and they were never seen apart, not at the market, not on the ridge, not in memory. And when a woman's labor turned to screams or when a child came too soon, too cold, it was not the town doctor who answered the call, but one of them, wordless, barefoot, always bearing a small linen bag, a braid of dried herbs twisted around the strap, and eyes that seemed to reflect the color of the sky just before a storm. They never knocked, they simply arrived, and once inside, they never left until the matter, whatever it was resolved. Sometimes in joy, often in blood, the townsfolk whispered that the sisters did not speak, but rather hummed not lullabies, but low, circular notes that made the glass beat on windows and the candles burn low. Others said they whispered in a tongue older than Latin, older than the hills themselves, and that the air grew heavy when they prayed. No census ever recorded them, no parish book bore their names, and yet everyone knew them, knew their shapes in the mist, knew the way animals grew quiet when they passed, knew the coppery smell that followed them like a shadow. The Carroways were not midwives, they said, but something else, something sent to shepherd life in and pull the dying back from the edge if only for a time. In a town ruled by crop yields and church bells, their presence was both necessary and feared, for where the Carroways walked, birth and death walked close behind, and the line between them thinned with every step. They were not women in the ordinary sense, the Carroway sisters, at least not in the way Dogwood Parish understood womanhood, which meant pliancy, scripture, and a trembling voice kept soft behind a veil. No, the Carroways were a different breed entirely, tall, angular, unbending even when bowed beneath storm clouds or suspicion, and always clad in funeral black, as if perpetually in mourning for a world the rest of the town could not yet see was dying. Eunice, the eldest, was known for her silence, but it was the kind of silence that echoed. Her gaze could still the breath in a room, and when she walked, even crows turned their heads. The middle sister, was always seen with her hands stained sometimes with sap, sometimes with something darker, her fingers calloused not from sewing or cooking, but from handling herbs that bloomed only beneath moonlight and whose names the townsfolk had long since forgotten. And then there was Merp, the youngest, if such terms even applied to creatures who never seemed to age. She was pale where the others were shadowed, always smiling faintly like someone listening to a story only she could hear. And children said her eyes flashed red when the wind turned. They moved like a single body in 3 forms when one stopped to speak. The others listened without turning. When one knelt to press a poultice to a crying mother's belly, the others flanked her like sentinels of bone and black cloth. They were never seen apart, never, not even at dusk, when they disappeared back up the hill to that tilting house that refused to collapse. People said they shared the same dreams, said that no matter where you spotted them, by the creek, the market's edge, the crossroads near Dead Elm Hollow, if you turned away even for a heartbeat, they were gone, and your pulse would thump strangely in your ears, as if something had moved through you. Some swore they could tell the sisters apart by scent alone. Burnt clove for Eunice, iron root for and wet earth for Merp. Others said those smells changed depending on the season, or the phase of the moon, or whether you were telling the truth when you spoke their names aloud. But the children always see clearer than the damned. They said the sisters floated when they thought no one was looking, just a fraction of an inch, just long enough to make you question your eyes. One boy claimed he saw all 3 of them step through a fence without opening the gate, their bodies thinning like smoke and then reconstituting on the other side. When his mother whipped him for lying, the boy did not cry. He only whispered, "They know now," and refused to sleep again until the preacher slipped a cross beneath his pillow. No one saw the Carroways for 3 days after that, but when they returned, the boy was gone and so was the cross. The first true record of the Carroway sisters did not arrive in any ledger meant for the living. It was found instead beneath a whitewashed, wooden cross at the edge of Dogwood's forgotten grave plot, a rusted tin box filled not with scripture or names etched in lineage, but with a brittle list of tragedies that bore no last names and no prayers. Eliza, ruptured womb; Charity, breech birth; Ruth, bled dry, each followed by 3 inked initials in a line no one dared decipher aloud. E.A. C. MC. There was no mistaking them. The sisters had no need for signatures when their shadow lingered long after the breath had left a body. It became difficult not to see the pattern, even for a town that tried very hard not to. Wherever the Carroways walked, death followed, not violently, not with screaming, but with the heavy solemnity of a long curtain being drawn. No one ever saw the sisters run, shout, or fight for a mother's life. They moved quietly, deliberately, as if carrying out a duty agreed upon long before flesh met breath. Some mothers died, some children survived, others were simply changed, but no matter the cost, the babies came back breathing, or most of them did, and for that, the people kept calling them. One gray winter, a farmer named Jonah Bray summoned Hal when his wife's labor turned to ice. The child came, small and silent, with blue under his fingernails but eyes too alert. Jonah said the boy never once cried. Not once. He just stared at the corners of the room with the gaze of something ancient, something waiting, and when Jonah tried to take him for a christening, he found the font at the chapel dry as bone, and the altar layered in the still bodies of dead flies. No movement, no explanation. He rode back with the baby wrapped in burlap, whispering prayers not found in his Bible. By spring, whispers began to root into the foundation of Dogwood, itself traded beneath market tents and behind stitched curtains, always beginning the same way. Have you heard? Mothers said their infants wouldn't sleep unless cradled in a ring of salt. One woman claimed her daughter wept blood every dusk until the Carroways returned and tucked a reed beneath her pillow. Another swore her baby's breath smelled of ash. A few refused to speak at all, but one voice rang louder than the rest. Wife of the preacher, who had buried 2 sons already and clung to the new one like cloth to flame. She claimed to have seen Ha Carroway kneeling at dawn beneath her elder tree, burying a lump wrapped in hair and twine. When confronted, Ha merely smiled and said, "It will keep the spirits from knowing." No one knew if she meant the dead or the living. Within the week, the preacher's wife fled Dogwood, screaming that her child had no shadow and would not speak the Lord's name. She was never seen again. That summer, when the heat pressed its elbows into the bones of the township and the sky refused to break, the church bell, Dogwood's iron-voiced sentinel, fell suddenly silent, not from rust, nor from storm, nor from the weight of time, but because the bell rope had been found sliced clean through, severed like tendon by something sharp and precise. The townspeople searched for signs of sabotage, but none were seen near the tower, only a faint scent of ash and something sweet, like rotting lavender. Whispers pointed, inevitably, toward the Carroways, not out of proof, but out of instinct. They were never seen at services, never knelt, never crossed themselves. They did not mouth scripture when the preacher cried verses into the wind. And yet, when sickness swept through the township, when the ash fever bloomed like bruises across the skin and took a dozen in a single week, it was not the doctor, not the priest, but an Eunice Carroway who arrived first at each threshold. She did not knock, she did not speak, she merely placed bowls of boiled bark and moss beneath cribs and whispered to the dying in a language no one could name. A cadence meant not for comfort but containment. Those who survived told the same tale, eyes wide and damp with something between awe and fear, the sound of hooves in the distance, too many to count, never drawing closer, always circling, and a cool, steady hand pressed against their chest in the worst of the fever, as if holding something down inside them, something clawing to get out. The doctor called it mass hysteria, the priest called it witchery, but the Carroways called it necessary. The veil weakens when the body burns, an Eunice said once to the constable's wife, her voice like smoke across water, and some things must not slip through. She did not elaborate, she did not need to. After that, some families began leaving cloves at their windowsills and salt circles at their doorposts, not out of belief, but out of desperation. Others fell to their knees in the chapel and begged the heavens to take back whatever curse had crawled into their soil, but the ground did not answer, and in the pews where the Carroways never sat, the wood began to warp. The preacher's voice grew hoarse, the scripture felt thinner, faith itself seemed to recoil. For if the Carroways were not of God, and certainly not of men, then what covenant allowed them to walk among the living, carrying breath in one hand and silence in the other? And if they were keeping something from crossing over, then what, exactly, had been trying to come through? It was in early August when the town's unease took on a face, and that face belonged to Levi Donald, a boy of 9 years. gap-toothed and sharp-tongued, the kind who chased chickens with sticks and threw stones at shadows just to see if they flinched. His older brother dared him one sweltering afternoon to climb the ridge and knock once, just once, on the crooked door of the Carroway house before running. Levi never made it to the door. He vanished into the thick salt-scorched brush near dusk, and when he returned hours later, he came barefoot, soaked through, his shirt clinging to his chest like a second skin, and I rolled so far inward it showed only white. He said nothing, not to his mother, not to the doctor who waved smoke beneath his nose, not to the preacher who arrived sweating with a cross pressed to his chest. Only when the preacher laid his hand on the boy's head did Levi whisper a single word, just one, soft and trembling, wailing. He never spoke again. The next morning, his hair had turned bone white, and he would not drink, would not sleep unless wrapped in wool and lavender. His family left Dogwood before the week was out, their wagon creaking beneath bundles and silence. But what truly broke the town was what came after. When a few of the braver men hiked the ridge to look for signs, they found no footprints, no broken stalks, nothing disturbed, save for a series of handprints, pressed deep into the dry dirt outside the Carroway gate. Small prints, far too small for any of the sisters, yet sunken so deep into the earth that it seemed whatever made them had pressed downward with the weight of grief itself. There were 14 of them, perfectly spaced, pointing inward like a prayer or a warning. One man tried to pour water into them, thinking to reveal their shape more clearly, but the dirt swallowed the liquid instantly, as if thirsty, as if waiting. When they told the preacher, he said nothing, only tightened the rope on the chapel's door, and refused to speak the sister's name again. After Levi, the air in Dogwood changed. There was a silence beneath the usual sounds, beneath the wind, the horse hooves, the market calls that fell to still, like the quiet before a scream. The animals sensed it too. Dogs began howling before dusk. Birds scattered in sudden flocks. And that night, the town's children dreamed of deep, wet places and the sound of something breathing in the walls. But no one dared ask what Levi had seen on that hill, because some things, they now believed, were not meant to be known. And worse, some things, once seen, would never stop looking back. Autumn came, but it did not arrive gently. It clung like a sickness, clawing at the season's throat and refusing to turn. The leaves browned but would not fall, clutching to the branches with brittle fingers, as though aware of something in the soil below. The air grew thick, not with rot, not with smoke, but with something that smelled of forgetting, wet leather, dried blood, and scorched feathers. Crows lingered too long on fence posts, staring in threes. Livestock miscarried in silent pairs, their carcasses found arranged in odd spirals, hooves curled inward, eyes glassy but wide, as though they had seen something in their final moments that made dying a kindness. Yet amid all this, the Carroway sisters carried on. They neither explained nor apologized. A stillbirth in the south orchard. Mirth was already there, standing in the hallway before the mother even called out. A breach near the river bend. Ha arrived with thread already strung and teeth stained green with chewed roots. No one summoned them anymore, not aloud. They simply came, and when they left, the rooms were silent. The candles burned to stumps, and the children, those that survived, often slept with their eyes open for days. Whispers turned to certainties in the mouths of those who had seen them, arrived before the first contraction, before the blood or pain, long before the midwife's bell could be rung. They can feel it, one old man muttered near the well, his eyes dull with drink and dread, like wolves before the snow, like dogs before a storm. A girl named Elise confirmed it with a shiver in her voice. She had not spoken in 3 years, her throat struck dumb by a lightning bolt that cracked a tree 3 feet from where she stood. And yet, she labored in silence as the sisters encircled her bed, not touching, not speaking, only humming in a slow, rising harmony that seemed to tremble the floorboards and turn the window glass soft. The room, she later wrote, had grown so bright she could see every crack in the ceiling beams. The children twins came just before dawn, one born with open eyes and the other with a smile that did not fade for 6 straight weeks. The doctor refused to examine them, said it was beyond him. The preacher, pale and sweating, claimed he had a funeral to attend every time someone mentioned the birth. Even the baker's wife who helped with the cleaning said the sheets smelled wrong afterward to clean, as though whatever came through had burned the memory of blood from the linen. By the second frost, the town was no longer divided between those who feared the Carroways and those who didn't, only between those who feared them and those who feared what might happen without them, because births had begun to change, and the children, they were coming into the world with too much knowing in their eyes. When the second frost settled on Dogwood Parish and the fields lay heavy with silence, 6 figures gathered beneath the chapel floor for men, 2 widows, all wrapped in shawls and secrets. Their voices kept low as if the wood itself might listen. They brought with them not weapons or scripture, but paper lists scrawled in trembling ink, each naming those touched by something strange. Women who bled too long but did not die. Children born to still who would not blink but somehow breathed. Houses where mirrors no longer cast reflection and rooms where light avoided corners. Every list ended with the same name, Carroway. No one spoke it above a whisper, not even the preacher, who had once defended the sisters from superstition with fire and faith. Now he sat pale-faced and hunched, staring at a knot in the floorboards as though the wood might part and swallow him. God turns his face, he muttered. God turns his face when they walked the hill. What they planned was not revenge. None of them believed they could punish the sisters. What they wanted was clarity, a reckoning. 3 would go, 1 for each sister, under the guise of gratitude. They would bring offerings elderflower, lamb's wool, dried honeycomb. They would smile, bow, and ask questions. And maybe, if God still lingered in Dogwood, they would return with answers. The next evening, the 3 set off at dusk, cloaked and solemn, their gifts held close. They were not fools. They knew what they risked, but silence, they reasoned, was a deeper danger. Only to return. The preacher's cousin and the glass-blower's son stumbled back near dawn, soaked to the knees in creek water, speaking little and blinking too often. Their offerings had been accepted, their hands not taken. They said. The sisters smiled. Said Murph sang under her breath the whole time. But Joel Minton III, a tanner known for his steady hands, was last seen stepping across the Carroway gate with a satchel slung over one shoulder and a polite nod in his walk. His satchel was later found unopened beside the creek. His boots stood upright on the Carroway porch, dry despite the rain that had come and gone. There was no blood, no signs of struggle, just 2 boots, pointed outward, as though he had stepped out of them to become something else. No one went looking, not truly. That Sunday, the chapel's pews were only half filled. The preacher stood at the pulpit but said nothing for a full minute. Then he opened his Bible to blank pages. "He is not here," he said finally, voice barely above a breath. Not anymore. That week, the Carroway house lit no lanterns. And yet, from the ridge, smoke still curled thin from the chimney, white and winding like a thread pulled from a wound. By the year's end, Dogwood Parish no longer sowed, not out of famine but fear. The fields were left fallow, not by drought, but by a quiet dread that took root deeper than any seed could grow. Couples kept to separate rooms. Mothers whispered caution to daughters in voices thin with warning. And no one, not even the young or foolish, spoke of starting families. Not with the wind moaning the way it did near the salt ridge. Not with the babies coming the way they had. One child was born with a full set of teeth. Another with eyes too old, too blue, like the glass eyes of taxidermy deer. One girl, quiet and pale as snowmalt, would only sleep beneath iron keys. When they took them away, she screamed until the windows cracked. No doctor in Dogwood offered explanation, only silence. And so the people waited. Waited for the earth to turn, for the sisters to vanish, for some great undoing to roll through and set things right. But the Carroway house remained, not louder, just present, watching. Its chimney smoked less often, though no one believed the sisters had left. Some said they had gone underground, that beneath their feather-stuffed beds rumored to be filled with plumes from black swans they'd carved hollows in the earth, chambers lit by waxless flame where their breathing slowed but never ceased. Others believed they were waiting, not hiding, but listening for a name no one knew yet, but that would unlock something old and unfinished, a ritual not quite closed. The atmosphere in Dogwood grew strange and heavy. Children born the year before began to change, quiet at first, a shifting in the face, a difference in posture. The way one boy bent toward the sun, as though drawn by something not light but heat. One mother found her daughter standing in the garden at midnight, bare feet dug into frost, humming a tune the Carroways were known to sing in harmony. And still no one dared visit the house. They watched from the base of the ridge, from windows and fence posts, catching glimpses how passing by with a tallow bundle in her arms, Murph brushing ash from the threshold, and Eunice standing at the gate, unmoving, as if waiting for something to crest the horizon. Nothing did, not yet, but everyone felt it, a pull in the marrow, a weight behind the moon. And then, one night, a stranger arrived. No one saw from where. No one heard the horse approach. He wore a dark coat, dusted from a long ride, and bore two things: one, a cross carved from burnt yew; the other, a letter sealed in wax, stamped with a sigil no one recognized. He said nothing to the townsfolk, only nodded once at the chapel's door, then turned toward the ridge. When he reached the Carroway gate, his horse stopped cold, nostrils flaring. Refusing to step further, the man dismounted without hesitation and walked the rest of the way alone. He did not return. But the next morning, The sun rose red to red and the wind carried no birdsong at all. By the year's end, Dogwood Parish no longer sowed, not out of famine but fear. The fields were left fallow, not by drought, but by a quiet dread that took root deeper than any seed could grow. Couples kept to separate rooms. Mothers whispered caution to daughters in voices thin with warning. And no one, not even the young or foolish, spoke of starting families. Not with the wind moaning the way it did near the salt ridge. Not with the babies coming the way they had. One child was born with a full set of teeth. Another with eyes too old, too blue, like the glass eyes of taxidermy deer. One girl, quiet and pale as snowmalt, would only sleep beneath iron keys. When they took them away, she screamed until the windows cracked. No doctor in Dogwood offered explanation, only silence. And so the people waited. Waited for the earth to turn, for the sisters to vanish, for some great undoing to roll through and set things right. But the Carroway house remained, not louder, just present, watching. Its chimney smoked less often, though no one believed the sisters had left. Some said they had gone underground, that beneath their feather-stuffed beds rumored to be filled with plumes from black swans they'd carved hollows in the earth, chambers lit by waxless flame where their breathing slowed but never ceased. Others believed they were waiting, not hiding, but listening for a name no one knew yet, but that would unlock something old and unfinished. A ritual not quite closed. The atmosphere in Dogwood grew strange and heavy. Children born the year before began to change, quiet at first. A shifting in the face, a difference in posture. The way one boy bent toward the sun, as though drawn by something not light but heat. One mother found her daughter standing in the garden at midnight, bare feet dug into frost, humming a tune the Carroways were known to sing in harmony. And still no one dared visit the house. They watched from the base of the ridge, from windows and fence posts, catching glimpses how passing by with a tallow bundle in her arms, Murph brushing ash from the threshold, and Eunice standing at the gate, unmoving, as if waiting for something to crest the horizon. Nothing did, not yet, but everyone felt it, a pull in the marrow, a weight behind the moon. And then, one night, a stranger arrived. No one saw from where. No one heard the horse approach. He wore a dark coat, dusted from a long ride, and bore two things: one, a cross carved from burnt yew; the other, a letter sealed in wax, stamped with a sigil no one recognized. He said nothing to the townsfolk, only nodded once at the chapel's door, then turned toward the ridge. When he reached the Carroway gate, his horse stopped cold, nostrils flaring. Refusing to step further, the man dismounted without hesitation and walked the rest of the way alone. He did not return. But the next morning, the sun rose red to red and the wind carried no birdsong at all. By the 11th week of red sunrises and milk curdling in cold kitchens, the names began to seep into dreams, not just chalked under beds or etched in glass, but whispered in sleep, carved along the edges of memory itself. People woke muttering syllables that curled like smoke and vanished before they could write them down. One farmer, a father of 7, was found standing waist deep in the shallows of the dried creek bed at dawn, eyes wide, arms outstretched, chanting something no one recognized. His wife said he had been sleepwalking, but the mud around him was covered in sigils drawn, not by foot or hand, but as if pressed into the earth by something sliding just beneath the surface. The preacher, still locked below the chapel, had begun scratching on the walls with his nails. Not words, symbols, spirals and spines, trees without roots, one circle nested inside another, like a womb within a womb. His humming had stopped, but his eyes now rolled as if watching something above him through the stone ceiling. The children, those born under the Carroway's touch, were changing faster. One boy no longer cast a shadow after dusk. Another girl refused to eat anything but blackberries, even when her gums began to bleed. A mother tried to leave with her child in the dead of night, taking the east road through the hollow, but was found 3 miles out. Cart toppled, horse missing, the child still sleeping soundly in the straw. The mother had no memory of leaving, no memory of ever having a child. She walked back to town barefoot, mumbling apologies to someone who wasn't there. That week, the well water turned dark, not muddy, not tainted, just dark, like ink that never reflected light. The council gathered again, though their numbers had dwindled. The remaining few dared not speak of action, only survival. One suggested prayer, another suggested salt. A third asked what would happen if they burned the house on the ridge, but his voice cracked as he said it, and the flame of the lantern nearby shrank to a blue pinprick, as if frightened. They said no more. The truth was this: the Carroway sisters had become less people and more presence. They were no longer seen walking the paths, but those who woke in the early hours often glimpsed figures behind the windows, too tall, too still, watching with patience rather than malice. And still, the names returned in dreams. And worse, Some claimed the names had begun to answer. A baker's apprentice named Lauren confessed he had been repeating one aloud every morning upon waking, and that each time he did, something in his room shifted slightly out of place. His boots turned inward, his lamp wick tied in a knot, his mirror fogged from within. "It's learning me," he said before he vanished. Not missing, vanished. His room untouched, his bed still warm, a name scrawled in flour on the floorboards, a name no one dared read aloud. It was in the 12th week that the town heard the knock not on any door, but from somewhere beneath the ground, a hollow rhythm like bone tapping bone, slow and deliberate, echoing through floorboards and cellar stones. Some said it came only at night. Others claimed they heard it just before rain, when the air thickened and the light turned gray and sour. Whatever it was, it followed a pattern. 3 knocks, then silence, then 3 more, always 3. The number hung in the air like a curse. In town ledgers, 3 names had marked the Carroway's burial records. 3 initials beneath every dead mother. 3 sisters, never apart. 3 figures seen behind the window glass even when only one had left the house. People stopped answering their doors altogether. Meals were left outside for neighbors. The chapel bell, long silent since its rope was sliced, began to sway on windless days, not ringing, just moving, like a pendulum. And then the children began to draw, not with ink or charcoal, but with things they weren't supposed to touch: ashes from the hearth, soot from lanterns, blood from bitten tongues. They drew doors, dozens of them, on walls, on floors, inside closets. But these doors were wrong. No handles, no hinges, just tall black rectangles, each one with 3 slashes carved vertically where the knob should be. The preacher's wife, though she no longer claimed that name, found one, drawn beneath her pillow, pressed into the feather ticking. "A door without a frame," she whispered, hands shaking, eyes hollow. "A door that's waiting to be named." She left town the next day, walking west into the trees and never returning. Her bed was found perfectly made, her shoes still at the footboard. That night, 3 fires lit simultaneously across Dogwood, not in homes, but in the spaces between them, in fields, in the dead corners of the orchard, beneath the old hanging tree where crows no longer nested. The fires burned white, made no smoke, and left no ash. By dawn, the grass beneath them was untouched. People began nailing their doors shut, not to keep something out, but to keep something from getting in through them, through their children, through the silence. No one spoke of the Carroways anymore. It was as if the sisters had become part of the land itself, not witches or healers, but thresholds, human doorways between what should be and what must not. A boy named Elias, only 4, stood in his family's barn one morning and said, "The lady with the missing hands showed me the inside of the door." When his mother asked who the lady was, he simply said, "She hums like Auntie Ha." That evening, they found every one of the barn's nails bent upward, pried loose as if by invisible teeth, and painted on the floor in milk, still warm and unspoiled, was a single phrase written in 3 childish hands: "Not all of us were born here." It was in the weeks that followed the red sun that Dogwood Parish learned the true shape of silence, not as peace, but as warning. The elders of the town, those with memories stitched in older fabric, began to change. They stopped speaking the names of things, not just the sisters, no. They refused to utter the name of the ridge, the well, the elder tree behind the chapel. They avoided the market at dusk, no longer looked children in the eyes, and when asked about the old ways, those muttered phrases for protection, the salted thresholds, the wreaths made of briar and sage, they turned their faces and said, "We were told not to remember." One woman, Edna Bales, who had once delivered calves and last rites with equal ease, was found pacing the creek bank in her nightgown, muttering something over and over in a language no one could translate. She had scratched 3 letters into her arms, VIT. When the town doctor stitched her up, she bit his hand so hard he lost a finger. That night, she vanished from her locked room. The only trace was a single strand of black hair tied around the doorknob in a perfect knot. The preacher, still locked in his cellar, had begun to hum the same tune the children sang in their sleep, a lullaby without words, low and slow, rising like a draft from beneath the floorboards. His wife refused to enter the house anymore. She claimed the walls had grown warm, and that the windows no longer reflected her face at all. But it wasn't just the old or the mad who were touched. Teenagers began waking with nosebleeds, dreams of staircases that descended forever, and the sound, always the sound of hooves on wet stone. One boy described it perfectly: "It's not galloping, it's circling, it's waiting." No one rode horses near the ridge anymore. They would buck, rear, or fall stone dead before crossing into its shadow. Even the ravens stopped landing on the chimney. They circled but would not perch, And then came the names, not shouted, not spoken, but etched, scratched onto window panes, carved into the underside of pews, drawn in chalk beneath children's beds. Names no one recognized, but which made the air tighten when spoken aloud. When Elias Joria, simple woodcutter who once helped build the very porch the Carroways, now haunted, tried to burn one of the chalk circles. He went blind in both eyes. Claimed the smoke whispered to him. Claimed it said, "It's not about birth, it's about return." The town, once small and warm and foolishly proud, had become a place of avoidance, windows shuttered even in daylight, doors nailed not to keep out the wind, but to keep in what might rise from the floorboards. No one visited the ridge anymore, but at night, lights could still be seen in the Carroway house, flickering not like lanterns, but like fireflies trapped in glass, soft, erratic, pulsing to a rhythm no heart had ever beat. As the winter deepened and snow refused to fall, the air in Dogwood Parish grew brittle, like breath held too long. Light bent strangely through windows, longer, darker, as if the sun no longer trusted the town. Crickets stopped chirping, clocks refused to tick, and the children changed, not all at once, but subtly, like frost forming on glass. They grew quiet, watchful. A baby in the weaver house stopped blinking entirely. A boy in the miller's loft slept, with his eyes open, and began whispering into the corners of the ceiling. When asked what he was saying, he replied, "I'm telling them where we are." No one asked who they were. A cradle in the partridge home began rocking on its own, slow and gentle, always between midnight and 3. The child inside it had never cried, not once, but on the 4th night, the mother awoke to find something else rocking. The cradle, something she could not see, only hear. The rasp of dry breath, the sound of feet that didn't quite touch the floor, and a faint, familiar hum she hadn't heard since her own mother died in childbirth with a Carroway at the foot of her bed. She never entered that room again. They moved the child to the cellar, where the fire never went out and the walls were thick with salt. But still, every morning, the cradle upstairs was rocking, and each day, the child smiled wider. By now, the townsfolk knew better than to seek answers. They began avoiding the river, whose water sometimes ran backward. They avoided reflections, mirrors, glass, even puddles, because too many people had begun seeing not themselves, but other things staring back. A man named Jacob Dim, who had never lost a child or called upon the sisters, awoke to find the name Merv carved into his chest, shallow, bloodless, like it had been traced with a fingertip of smoke. He hung himself by noon. His note was just one word: reckoning. No one took it down. No one buried him. They simply closed his door and left it so. And still, the Carroway house stood quiet on the ridge, unmoving, its chimney trailing a thin, sweet-smelling smoke that made dogs howl and birds veer off course. Some said they saw movement in the orchard behind the house, figures gliding between dead trees, hands cupped around candlelight that never flickered. Others claimed that the house no longer leaned left, but slightly forward, as if listening, or watching, or waiting. Whatever had been gestating in the shadows of Dogwood Parish had begun to stir. And it wasn't just birth the sisters had ushered into this world, it was something else, something old and patient, something that knew every door had two sides. And for the first time, the people of Dogwood realized they had never asked what price the sisters paid for what they returned breathing, because not everything born should be. By the 14th week, Dogwood Parish no longer buried its dead. Graves would not stay closed. Coffins, no matter how tightly nailed or salted, were found ajar by morning soil stirred, wood warped, and nothing inside but shrouds curled like shed skin. The preacher's grave, exhumed by moonlight for fear of what he had become, was found empty save for his collar and a tooth, lodged in the side of the coffin, too large for any man, too sharp for any beast. The ground behind the chapel bulged in places now, as though something beneath it turned slowly, repositioning itself with patient certainty. And beneath the elder tree behind the garden where Hawk Carroway had once been seen burying a lump wrapped in twine and hair, there were now dozens more, small bundles knotted in animal sinew, each giving off a warmth not of fire, but of blood. No one dared touch them, but one boy, a stable-hand's son who hadn't spoken since his sister was born, with lidless eyes, bent to peer beneath the roots, and came back with a fistful of teeth, not human, not childlike, but flat and wide, like the teeth of something that had chewed too many names. He offered them to the blacksmith without a word, dropped them on the anvil, and walked home barefoot through frost. That night, the blacksmith's furnace roared to life unbidden, and he was last seen hammering something invisible, sparks leaping in silence from a hammer that struck air. When the townsfolk entered his shop the next morning, the iron tools were gone, the floor was scorched, and the word newness had been etched into every windowpane from the inside. Outside, birds were falling mid-flight, cows refused to produce milk, time itself bent in places. A man reported seeing his dead father seated at the dinner table, mouthing words in reverse, pointing toward the ridge. One widow awoke to find herself 7 months pregnant, though she had not lain with a man since the death of her husband 3 winters past. The child kicked not with feet, but with fingers. They say the wind changed direction then, began blowing toward the Carroway house rather than away, drawing breath like lungs prepared for incantation. The air itself carried a hum, barely perceptible but persistent, and no matter where you went, forest, barn, cellar, it sounded as though it were just behind you, whispering something with lips that never touched flesh. And in the orchard, the trees began to bloom again. Out of season, white petals streaked with red, each one marked at its center with a perfect black dot like an eye, closed. One man tried to burn the orchard. He vanished. His boots were found standing in the ashes upright, dry, and still laced. It was then the townsfolk began to understand. The Carroways had never been waiting for something to come. They had been tending something already here. And now it was blooming. They called it blooming because there was no better word. But what came in that 15th week was no part of any season. It was too deliberate, too precise. The orchard beyond the Carroway house erupted in pale blossoms streaked with crimson, and at first glance, they resembled flowers. But they had weight to them. They didn't sway in wind. And when one fell and struck the shoulder of a farmhand named Tillis Bear, he collapsed screaming, his arm blistering as though from fire. It took 5 men to hold him down as he howled that the petals were whispering, "Open the cradle, open the cradle, open the cradle." His mouth filled with blood not his own, and when he finally went still, they said it looked like he had aged 20 years in a single hour. His hair turned white, his nails blackened, and in his coat pocket they found 3 more petals, folded neatly, still warm. That same night, mothers across Dogwood reported hearing lullabies through the walls, soft and distant, sung in triplets, the voices overlapping, indistinguishable from one another, rising and falling like breath through a gravicloth. Children woke weeping, not from fear, from longing. One girl pointed to the ceiling and said, "She misses her baby." When asked who she meant, the girl looked confused and said, "The house." The orchard continued to blossom, but not outward, inward. The trees turned subtly, their trunks bending as though bowing toward the Carroway house, their roots cracking stone, splitting fence posts, and in the space beneath the branches, the soil began to darken, not from rain, but from something thicker, something that moved when no one touched it. One morning, a farmer discovered hoof prints in the orchard, dozens, perfectly shaped, leading nowhere, stopping nowhere, just pressed into the ground, deep and wide, circling the trees in spirals like ritual marks. But no horse had passed through. The preacher, locked still in his cellar, awoke from a 4-day sleep and began laughing, not madly, calmly, as if he had heard a joke from behind the veil. He said only one thing before falling back into silence. It was never about midwifery. It was about guardianship. He would not speak again. The Carroway house, meanwhile, remained still, its curtains drawn, its windows dark, its walls humming with a pressure that made the air around it shimmer like heat on stone. No one approached, but every night, lights flickered deep within the orchard, 3 at a time, always in the same formation, as if outlining a cradle too large to carry, too old to rock. And when the wind rose, it did not sound like wind. It sounded like something breathing in unison, steady and low, waiting to be named. The people of Dogwood knew, finally, that what had been seeded long ago was not a spell nor a curse but a womb, one the sisters had fed with silence, sacrifice, and song. And now it had begun to stir.